Hi everyone, my name is Amy Hollander and I will be presenting to you today, Stop Reading the Slides. This is a presentation for Nicholls State Summer Professional Development. Why this topic? Well, ironically, I have to read you these slides since our PD is going to be asynchronous and online this summer. And unfortunately, I didn't have a chance over the spring semester to record my students trying out some of these active learning techniques. When we surveyed our students this spring about the things that faculty had done very well during pandemic teaching and areas of improvement, the number one complaint about this past year's learning experience was that faculty were just reading from the slides. They weren't having students do anything with the information, and they were not actively engaging with the students. Now, we were in an online hybrid high flex environment, and for many of us, this was a very new modality. However, we have this wonderful opportunity with our students this fall as we go back to our face-to-face or face-to-face and hybrid modalities to try some new active learning techniques. Additionally, we can incorporate some of the really cool educational technology that we learned over these past 2 years and apply them to these active learning techniques. And finally, your students are used to active learning. They have been experiencing active learning in K-12 for many years now. So what are the benefits of active learning? The benefits to using such activities are many, including improved critical thinking skills, increased retention and transfer of new information, increased motivation, and improved interpersonal skills and decreased course failure. And I think most of us can agree that all of these skills and benefits are important to us in our own courses. During the annual NESE survey, the consistent results of this data show that hands-on, integrative, and collaborative active learning experiences lead to high levels of student achievement and personal development. So how do you decide what activities or questions you should use if you are going to attempt active learning in your courses? So you need to ask yourself the following. What are the most important things students should learn from this class session? And then think about how you can incorporate an active learning technique to get that across. You could also ask what misconceptions or difficulty do students commonly have as it relates to this content. And then you can use an active learning technique to have them practice that concept or for them to identify that misconception. And you can also ask yourself, what kind of practice can students do that will help them prepare for an upcoming assignment or assessment? So if you're expecting your students to be able to edit a paper, be able to identify where the major mistake in making that sauce is, or be able to diagnose a specific type of disease, or identify the correct management modality they should be using for a client, this would be a great opportunity for you to try that. If you ever come to one of my classes, you will see that I never lecture for more than 15 to 20 minutes, mostly because I start to bore myself, but also you can start to see the droopy eyelids in my students. So I ask myself these questions and then decide, what is the specific technique that I should incorporate into my lecture? Other considerations you should consider when implementing active learning is you should consider explaining the rationale of why are we doing this. Students are going to buy in and be more enthusiastic if they understand why we are asking them to talk to each other, work in groups, do this difficult case study. They will buy in more if they understand the why. Also consider, what is your facilitation approach? Really think about if you need time for students to break out into groups? Do you need to rearrange the furniture in your classroom? Do you need to bring specific supplies for this active learning? I'm old school, and although we have this great educational technology like clickers and Kahoot and Google Docs and all these other wonderful things that we can use, sometimes I just want my students to write something down on little scraps of paper. But that means that I need to make sure that I have writing implements and those scraps of paper for them, because they might have only brought their Chromebook or their iPad or their laptop to class. You also need to consider, how are you going to keep your students on task? Students need a sense of accountability. So if you are expecting your students to come to class prepared, telling them ahead of time that they need to get their readings done so that they can participate fully in a class activity that will result in an assessment, they're more likely to do that activity. Also consider how you're going to wrap up the activity. Now, this is where I love educational technology. If your students are building a presentation or a Jamboard or a Google document, that might be where you wrap up and you all examine on the screen in your classroom whatever it is that they've collectively created. And then finally, you need to be consistent in that if you are going to be attempting to use active learning this semester, you should be consistent. You should try to do it once a week or every other week. And you should also ask for student feedback. I always like to ask my students, so how did this go? If we were to do this again, what would you like to see differently? Do you want different partners? Do you want me to group you differently? Did you feel like you got something out of this? Those are all great things that you can get from your students. And if you don't have time in class to get that student feedback, that can make a terrific discussion board that week in your Moodle shell. There are 3 major challenges to active learning, and I can already hear some of you saying them. The first challenge is student resistance. The second challenge is time. Everyone has so much to teach in one semester, and they don't have time for active learning. And some professors and instructors might feel that students don't want to work together. So let's address all 3 of these major challenges. The first one is student resistance. I highly recommend that you introduce these activities early in the semester and make your expectations for participation clear. I'm talking the first week of class. You try to get them meeting each other and working together. If you use active learning frequently, at least once a week initially, and you vary the active learning strategies you use, after the first several sessions, students will understand that you're serious about the active learning and will accept their role as participants. I'm a big fan of making my active learning a low stakes assessment. So they know that that this is a formative assessment that I am using, and they know that they will be receiving some sort of point value for their participation. I like to explain to students why we're using active learning and the benefits they can expect from it. So if I'm telling them why we're using a think, pair, share, or why we're using a case study, and then explain the benefits, they're going to be more likely to buy in. Be committed to your choice of using active learning and communicate that confidently to your students. This might be uncomfortable for your students. Consider if you're a freshman and you don't know a lot of folks in your class, and now this professor that you don't know is expecting you to work with these strangers. Being confident in your ability to execute the instruction and to provide confidence to these students will be very helpful. And I would always say start small and simple. Use low impact strategies first, and then you can always scaffold up to those higher level strategies. And I have a terrific graphic I'm going to show you in a few minutes that shows you the range of active learning that you can try. Everyone tells me this: I don't have time to do activities in my class. Well, we've all just spent 2 to 4 semesters recording ourselves So you can use your recordings from past semesters and require your students to watch those recordings before coming to class and then do really cool active learning in your classroom. You can use strategies to efficiently reconvene the large group at the end of a learning activity. For example, I personally like to use Google timers on the board that when they go off, it sounds like a ship's about to go down, but you can also ring a bell or flash the lights. Consider your learning objectives carefully. Based on them, what content is most important for your students to master? Remove the non-essential content that you can spend more time on activities that lead to better student learning. I'm a big proponent of cutting out the fluff. If what you're presenting is not going to add to your students' understanding of the concepts at hand, it's not worth presenting. And consider what content you must cover in class and what content students can cover outside class by themselves. Again, that's where you can use the instructional videos that you recorded in previous semesters, or you can have them do their assigned reading and then take a required Moodle quiz before they even step into your classroom to ensure your students are prepared for that day's activity. And then finally, the third challenge is that students don't want to work together. As part of your activity, instructors tell your students to get into groups first and introduce each other. I really love using active learning, particularly in my first year general education courses, because this allows students to meet other students in their classes and start to build a rapport. On my first day of class, I ask all my students to look at the person in front of them and introduce themselves to that person. Then I say, look at the person behind you and introduce yourself. Look at the person to your left and to your right. And then I tell them, you have just made potentially 4 contacts for this class. And you can become friends and you can email each other if you miss class, and you can ask each other questions if you've missed something. And then if you're still confused, you can always contact me. Consider whether your activity is challenging enough to require 2 or more people to work on it. Sometimes you might try out an active learning activity and realize that students could have just done it on their own, and there's no real reason for you to create these partners or small groups. So design your activities where there is genuine value in working together. Also, at the beginning of the semester, you might have people who are working alone, and you might want to encourage them to work with a nearby group or ask the group to invite the individual to join them. There might be people who they might have a lot of social anxiety and may not be comfortable working in groups with others, but you can at least try to incorporate them as best you can. And then consider assigning students to a single group so students know who they are accountable to all semester. This works really well, and I would tell you that if you're considering doing this, look up intentional grouping and consider how you are going to intentionally group your students. I would mix them up based on GPA and year. I would also look at the diversity in your classroom and really consider how to make really good groups. Some professors who use year-long groups will have those groups assess each other, the members, and also be able to kick people out of their group if they're not pulling their weight in the group work. So this is a variety of active learning techniques that you can try in the fall. This graph goes from the simplest to the most complex. And so you'll see for simple, there are minute papers, self-assessment, large group discussions, think, pair, shares, informal groups. And as you move on up this graph, you can see that things get a little bit more complex and complicated. So I've cherry picked a few what I would consider either pretty easy or pretty universal active learning techniques that you can try. For the faculty that are watching this right now that are like, oh yeah, I already do this and I'm looking for more complex techniques, please go through the additional resources in the Moodle shell and find new active learning techniques that challenge you and would challenge your students. So the first active learning technique that you can do is think, pair, shares. In think, pair, shares, you have students first work on a given problem individually, and you give them some time, and then they compare their answers with a partner and then synthesize a joint solution to share with the class. Often this group discussion is considered sharing and is followed up with a larger classroom discussion. Some think, share, pair activities are super short. A quick response, quick think, pair, share could take maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And then sometimes the activities may be longer and more involved, like an extended think, pair, share. I really like using think, pair, shares with clickers. What I like to do is ask the students to all individually answer a multiple choice question. Then I allow the students to then share their thought process with a partner in the classroom, usually their neighbor, and then allow them to resubmit their answer. And then we can compare the differences in how many people selected the correct answer initially, and then after the discussion. And then after that, what I do is I have my students tell me why they ended up changing their answer and why the correct answer is the correct answer. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can also, if you don't use clickers in your classroom, you could do a Kahoot quiz. You could have them write down things on little sheets of paper like I do. You can also include physical movement. So you could have your students all move to different corners of your classroom based on their answer. And then after they talk to their partners, have them get up and move around again to decide what the correct answer is. If we were sitting together in a classroom, I would have you all look at this picture and think about what you see, and then select from a couple of answers. So some folks might see what they would perceive as a gentleman with a beard and a pipe, and others might see a horse. And then I would have you all share your answers with each other and then decide as a consensus what you initially see in this picture. Another technique is brainstorming. I really love brainstorming for more complex open-ended questions. These are terrific for providing different scenarios to your students. They're also really good for starting a new chapter or a new group of concepts in your course. So you introduce a topic or a problem, and then you ask for students' input. Brainstorming is a large or small group activity that encourages students to focus on a topic and contribute to the free flow of ideas. I will say this, you need to teach your students how to discuss their ideas in an open and respectful manner. So you may have to model that before you let them go and go for it. And you need to ensure that there's no one that's kind of taking over that group. Again, this is where intentional grouping would be very helpful. The teacher may begin a brainstorming session by posing a question or a problem, or by introducing a topic. And then students express possible answers, relevant words, or ideas. Contributions are accepted without criticism or judgment and usually summarized on a whiteboard by the teacher or scribe as the ideas are called out. This is a terrific way to use Jamboard. This is a terrific way to use Google Docs or Google Slides, because you could have your students contributing their ideas in real time. And you really can give them big picture problems that what they're learning about can be applied. So if you're teaching ecology, you can discuss climate change. If you are teaching a cooking course, you could you could be getting to the concept of emulsification. If you're teaching a lit course, you could be talking about a big literary concept or a business course. So there's a lot of like big picture ideas and questions that you can pose. And then what's really great is you can then take a step back and teach them the more specific details to this concept, and they can see how it applies to this bigger picture question. It's also a good way for you to assess your students' prior knowledge. So what do they already know about this topic so that you know what you need to focus on in future lectures. Another terrific active learning technique that I really like to use in upper level courses is role playing. This is where you have your students act out a part. And in doing so, they get a better idea of the concept and theories being discussed. Role-playing exercises can range from simple, what would you do if a friend drank too much alcohol at your party, to the more complex. A patient comes into your office exhibiting the following symptoms, or I want you to act out cell replication and you are the cell, or you are the different parts of the cells, like each person gets assigned a different part of the cell. You can have them role play various business scenarios. You can have them role play different patient and doctor interactions or physician interactions that might happen. You could role play what would happen in a laboratory situation. So there's a lot of ways for us to use role playing. I know that in allied health and nursing, you all use role playing a lot, which is terrific because you're preparing them for the real world. And we do as well in teacher education. But I do think you can get really creative in role playing in other areas. I always think about ecology and how cool it would be to role play some sort of ecological concept like carrying capacity. Or I would have my 400 level biology students role play different concepts of cell molecular biology, and they thought it was so weird. I'd be like, okay guys, I want you guys to act out cellular transport. And they all look at me like, what is she talking about? But they figure it out, and if they really understand the concept, they're going to find a way to act out or role play. Another one of my favorite active learning techniques is using case studies, and case studies can be used across the university. These are real life stories that describe what happened to a community, family, school, industry, or individual to prompt students to integrate their classroom knowledge with the knowledge of the real world situation, actions, and consequences. The key to a good case study is that it is relevant and real life. So this would really happen in real life, and it's relevant to your students. Immediately, I know my allied health and nursing folks are like, oh yeah, we use case studies all the time, but I also know that case studies are used predominantly in our business education, where students get to look at various management scenarios. In culinary, I think this would be so terrific to use case studies so students can discuss what went wrong with that dish, or how was that restaurant or the front of the house poorly managed. There's a lot of ways to use case studies. And here's the best part. You don't have to come up with your own case studies. There are plenty of case studies in the literature. There are whole websites for case studies in various disciplines. And then I really like to have my students write their own case studies for their course. And then we use the best ones in active learning. Something I used to do in my pathogenic microbiology course is I would have my students write case studies assigned to them about different microorganisms. And then we would take those case studies and we would role play in class, act them out, and we would play the game Guess That Microbe, where students had to guess what the microbe is based on the acted out case study. My students loved it, and we always did it as a review before an exam because it was a great way for them to test their own knowledge, and also an opportunity for me to start asking them questions like, how do you treat this disease? What kind of microorganism is this? How do you get this microorganism? How do you prevent getting this microorganism? And so forth. So case studies are a really great way to use active learning in the classroom. Your students will have to be prepared for that case study. So that means that they will have to do the required reading or listen and watch pre-recorded lectures to have the content knowledge they need to successfully solve a case. And then finally is Jigsaw. Jigsaws are great, but they can get really complicated. I can tell you that in high schools, they are commonly used. My students like to use them a lot in their high school classes. The class is divided into several teams, with each team preparing a separate but related assignment. When all team members are prepared, the class is redivided into mixed groups with one member from each team in each group. And each person in the group teaches the rest of the group what they know, and the group then tackles an assignment together that pulls all the pieces together. This is super complicated. So you have to be really well organized, and you really need to think about what is the final product you want your students to be able to do. This technique can be used equally well for assignments involving data analysis or field work, and in an assignment involving reading. Sometimes I use very simple jigsaws where I will have my students break up into groups A, B, C, and D, and everyone in A, everyone in B, everyone in C, and everyone in D is assigned a different reading, and they need to take notes on that reading and decide what are like the top 5 things that you need to take from that reading. And then I remix it up where then groups are in different teams, and those teams would consist of one person from A, one person from B, one person from C, one person from D, and they would teach the rest of the group the top 5 things they learned from that reading and apply it to whatever assignment I'm giving. You have to prepare several different but related assignments for the class, and each team then prepares one of the assignments. Once each team is prepared, they're divided into 4 new groups. You're going to have to make sure that you are the one grouping your students initially. You also need to make sure that everything makes sense and flows. This is a very complicated active learning technique. However, you can probably find online some really terrific lessons in your area of expertise. I always think about in languages and literature how you all can use Jigsaw, particularly if you're trying to find examples of a specific theme or concept. I think Jigsaw is a great way to do something like this. And then the group, like I said, puts all the pieces together to complete a group task that can only be answered once all the team pieces are together, hence the name Jigsaw. If you're really interested in trying to do a jigsaw and you want to talk to someone about if your game plan makes sense, feel free to contact me, because this I found very intimidating for myself to try. And so I really had to start small and work my way into it. But I have found it to be very beneficial and rewarding, and my students seem to really enjoy it as well. So this is the challenge. Can you incorporate one active learning technique from this presentation or the additional information provided in this Moodle lesson into your course next semester? I challenge you to not read the slides for your 50 minutes or your hour and a half, because you don't have to. And how much more fun is it if you can get your students to talk to each other and talk with you about this information? And it doesn't matter if you teach a class of 5 or a class of 125. You can incorporate active learning. It might look different. You might need to use clickers and educational technology in these much larger classrooms versus your smaller classes, but you can still accomplish active learning. Consider what challenges you will need to overcome. And can you use this active learning technique as an assessment? Could you use these as low-stake assessments? Or could you have your students use their experience with that active learning technique for a low-stakes assessment on Moodle, like a quiz or a discussion board? If you need additional resources, these are the resources I used for this particular presentation, but please go to our Moodle module and you can see additional resources. There's a ton of papers and explanations on how to do various active learning techniques. And again, you are welcome to contact my office anytime if you want to discuss further how to incorporate active learning into your lectures. Take care and have a great fall semester. Thank you.